As Susan said, I'm representative of the government of Venezuela here in the West Coast. And I've been involved in diplomacy for 4 years. And as many other Venezuelan diplomats, I come from other fields, from activism, journalism, computer science in my case. So we have multiple skills that it turns out for the current political context in Venezuela, it makes our work a lot easier. I had to start by saying that Venezuela is a democracy. A lot of progressive people don't know this. Recently, I met someone, I live in San Francisco, I met someone recently who said, yeah, and well, I support Chavez, he's doing good things, in spite of, you know, the fact that he's a dictator, but he's a cool guy. It's like, well, he's not a dictator, and a lot of people don't know this. If you watch, for instance, last night, while you were here at the convention, I was in my home packing to come here this morning, and I was browsing through the channels. So on NBC, there was this show, new comedy show called Parks and Recreation, and they had, the subject last night was Venezuela. They were having a delegation from Venezuela of officials from the government who work in Parks and Recreation, and all of them were dressed in military uniforms with red berets and these big bands like the presidents there wear the day of the inauguration. But they made all this big deal about the country being a dictatorship basically, and a rich country, because basically these officials from Venezuela were throwing money at everybody, like, I give you $10 to peel that banana for me, and So anyway, if you look at, it's no longer just Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity or CNN. It's also, it had penetrated, mainstream media like NBC, the demonizing of Venezuela. Fortunately, what started just in Venezuela has expanded to to many countries in Latin America. So it's no longer Venezuela, the lone ranger in the region, along with Cuba. We have been joined by several countries. There's actually a very distinctive shift to the left in South America that can be seen by, if you look at, for instance, the election of many progressive leaders in the region, that's one indication, but that's just an electoral expression of what's lying beneath, which is the growth of the social movements that make it possible for candidates from third parties to win elections in these countries. I had to start by saying that a lot of people ask when they hear Chavez responding to, say, for instance, former President Bush in a very strong way, calling him names and things like that. People don't think of the context in which those comments are made. And I always point to the fact that Chavez, since the beginning of his term, his first term, wanted to have good relations with the US, and he went to Wall Street and he closed one of the sessions at 4:15 in Wall Street, and then he went to the New York Mets Stadium and pitched the first ball, and then he went to the White House and visited Clinton. So it's a guy who wanted good relationship with the US. So it wasn't until Bush came into office, or as they say in the case of Chavez, took power. See the change in language, so no, they don't call it the Chavez administration, they call it the Chavez regime, which, it makes a difference in semantics, and it causes that effect of people thinking of Chavez as a dictator. So I'm glad that the Guild has organized delegations to Venezuela. I hope in the future they can organize another one, because it opens the eyes for people, not only what's happening in Venezuela, but in general in Latin America. You will see, for instance, the media is completely free to say whatever they want against the president. We don't have only one Fox News. We have like 20 Fox Newses in the country who are, who never say anything positive about the government. So we had this coup attempt in 2002 against Chavez, in which 2 months before the coup leaders visited the White House and the State Department, and then we had a coup. Nobody, of course, the U.S. denied that they were involved, but a lot of people think that they were. And if you look at the level of economic support through the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID to Venezuelan opposition groups, which continues under the Obama administration, it's just an indication of the hostilities. Imagine that President Ahmadinejad in Iran establishes the National Endowment for Islam and starts sending funds to the National Lawyers Guild and to Acorn and to all those. I mean, people here would become outraged. So with these hostilities, and Chavez wanted to have good relations with the US, and Chavez wanted to, his main intention at the beginning was to establish a sort of capitalism with a human face. That's why Marxists like me, I've been a Marxist since 1990. Now it doesn't sound that bad, but believe me, throughout the 90s, saying that you're a Marxist is like believing in UFOs. It still kind of is. But I think since the Seattle protest, here in Seattle, I'm glad to be here, first time I've been here. By the way, it looks just like the way I imagined, rainy, cloudy. Things started to change. And so Chavez, became convinced that because he wanted to have this national project of, progressive nationalistic capitalism, strengthen the local industry and all that, and the local business class didn't want to join his project. So he had to look for alternatives. And for instance, when we wanted to establish a social program for medicine, because our hospitals were in ruins, they came up with the idea of establishing neighborhood clinics. So they put an ad in the paper to call for Venezuelan doctors to go to the poor neighborhoods and staff these clinics. Only 70 doctors signed up nationwide. So we, talked to the Cubans. They've been sending doctors everywhere. So we established a program through which Cuban doctors come to Venezuela and they work in these poor neighborhoods. And we had totally decentralized healthcare, and we have brought healthcare to the poor communities. And we have kids who reached the age of 12 and they've never seen a doctor in their lives. And now they have the doctor right there in the neighborhood. So in 2004, Cuba and Venezuela established an organization called the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. Bolivarian in the honor of Simón Bolívar, which is the leader of independence for 5 countries in South America, was born in what is known now as Venezuela. So it was with the intention of counteracting the establishment of the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, the FTAA. Since the Clinton administration, they tried to establish this agreement. Basically, it will be like a NAFTA, but continent-wide to span the South America and Central America. And because of these reactions against neoliberalism, we have actually tried neoliberalism in the 80s and the 90s, and we followed all the recipes mandated by the IMF and the World Bank, and they didn't work. So we wanted to look for something else. So so this agreement was aimed at counteracting the FTAA, and basically what we're trying to do is establish trade agreements and political agreements that are aimed at complementing economies and helping balance the asymmetries that we have in our economies. For instance, Venezuela imports still about 70% of the food that we consume. We've been trying for many years, even before the Chavez administration. There was a land reform in the 60s. It didn't work because farmers were given land, but they weren't given any machinery or any credits to grow the crops. So they ended up selling the land back to the big landowner, which recomposed their big latifundia. So we've been making big progress in Venezuela. Last year, for the first time in 15 years, we didn't import any rice or any corn, but still we're heavily dependent on food imports. So through ALBA, for instance, Nicaragua sends cows to Venezuela to rebuild our cattle ranching industry, which is in ruins. We are right now building an oil refinery in Nicaragua, which will allow Nicaragua to satisfy their gasoline energy needs and export gasoline and oil derivatives to the rest of Central America. That is just one example of this cooperation. It goes beyond the countries that make up this trade group, which are actually Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Dominique, Honduras, Ecuador, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and their 2 observing countries, which are Antigua and Barbuda and Grenada and Paraguay. Grenada, yeah, the country invaded by, anyway, you know the story. I'm a diplomat. I cannot be, sometimes talk in the terms that I would like to, but you get the point. So, within the framework of this agreement, we established several institutions. One is the Banco del Alba, the Bank of the Alba, which is actually our current ambassador Venezuelan ambassador in DC was actually the guy who was in charge of getting the bank off the ground, and then he was sent back as ambassador. So now another person is going to be appointed to head the bank. But basically, the bank is to finance microloans, microfinancing, but with specific goals. As I said, countries have, the neoliberal model says that if you export country and coffee, if you export oil and coffee, just keep doing that and buy everything else. And that model hasn't worked. When we have embargoes, we have world economic problems, then if an economy that's depending on only one product or two products, you're going to have a lot of problems. And especially now with this issue of biofuels, it's not my specialty, but I think most of you are already familiar with what happens when you start using corn to fill your Hummer. Then the price of corn goes up. Yeah, because it's see the political thing. They've been trying to sell biofuels as a way to steer away from evildoers. The Venezuelans, the Middle East. We don't want that oil. We want to use corn to feed our. It's not like we had to increase public transportation. So we can keep using the Hummers, but instead of evil oil, we put corn in it, and it'd be good. So we have, with an example, to give another concrete example of what we've been doing on this framework. Venezuela, in cooperation with Cuba, we established a literacy program 4 years ago, and Venezuela was able to virtually eradicate illiteracy. So even UNESCO recognized that and declared that Venezuela is an illiteracy-free territory. That means that the level of illiteracy that we have is so low that only people who are either too old or people who don't want to learn, those are the people who remain illiterate. But anybody who wants to learn and is young enough can learn how to read and write. Similar thing happened with Nicaragua recently. A program that was created in Cuba is being used in other countries and also in Bolivia because you cannot have meaningful working democracies if you have a high percentage of the population who are illiterate. The agreement, this kind of cooperation goes beyond countries that are part of the ALBA. To give you an example, what we have going on with Argentina, for instance. I remember 4 years ago, President Chavez visited Argentina, and close to where they were meeting, there was a protest of shipyard workers in Argentina, which were protesting privatization of their shipyard. And then Chavez wanted to know what's all that commotion, what's going on? Oh no, President, forget it. It's just some union people making noise. Oh, well, bring them in. So they brought the union members, and they explained that they have families, and and then Chavez asked his minister of petroleum, well, don't we have a fleet of oil tankers? Where do we send those ships to be fixed? And then the minister came back and said, well, we send them to Houston and to Europe, to Germany, to be repaired. And then he said, well, these guys here said that they can repair oil tankers, so why don't we establish an agreement to stop depending on Houston and on Europe, and rebuild the Argentine shipyard industry by bringing our ships here. And actually that went beyond that, because actually we are right now contracted the building of 2 oil tankers in Argentina, and that just those 2 contracts have managed to revitalize that industry and prevent 500 families from going into unemployment. So we benefit, and at the same time, another neighboring country benefits too by this type of agreement. So it might be more expensive. Some people are saying that at the end it's going to cost more to send the ships down there than to send them to Houston, where they have more modern machinery. But this is what's important about government having a regional view of things and not just an individualistic mentality. So if we are together there are a lot of things that Argentina is doing, for instance, that a lot of people might say is not in their benefit. For instance, they're helping us to revitalize our cattle ranching industry in Venezuela. And Argentina makes a lot of money. Argentine private cattle ranchers make a lot of money exporting meat to countries like Venezuela. But the government of Argentina, as a strategic measure, said that, well, we had to help Venezuela rebuild their, their meat industry because they're importing too much. So it might seem like they're acting against the interests of their own countries, but see how these two measures that seem, I don't see business leaders, the CEO of a company doing things like this. It just doesn't work that way in the capitalist mentality. So those are, I think Susan told me to, provide concrete examples because that gives you an idea. But there are many other things that I can, and you probably have questions and doubts about some things. But there's a very important thing that just happened today. They signed an agreement to establish a common currency for all these countries. It's called the Sucre. It's actually, it will not be a bill or a coin. It's actually a virtual currency to do trade. It's some sort of a credit card that countries have to exchange, goods and services and so on, but not depending on the dollar. And this is something that is, oh, well, Hugo Chavez against anti-American. No, this is something that a lot of countries are saying that the dollar, it's just countries are losing a lot of money by trading in dollars. So, or some other countries are making, financing their deficits by having, trading in dollars. Don't mention any names. But, so, the ALBA goes beyond the issue of trade and commerce. It goes also on the political front. ALBA countries, for instance, recently there was a summit of the Americas in the island of Trinidad and Tobago, and that's where President Chavez and President Obama shook hands, and where everybody thought that U.S. policy towards Latin America was going to finally be different. The establishment of 7 military bases in Colombia by the U.S. is not a good sign of that hope and change that we were all waiting for. But still, we're still hoping. President Chavez went to the UN 3 weeks ago and said that it no longer smells of sulfur, but it smells of hope. But that hope is just smell, and we want that hope to translate into reality. And so far, the signs have not been very encouraging. We still have the case that many of you lawyers are very familiar with, the case of Mr. Posada Carriles, a Cuban Venezuelan terrorist who blew up and confessed that he blew up a Cuban airliner. He's the Bin Laden of Latin America, and he's walking free in the beaches of Miami, and nobody's doing anything against him. Only there's I think a minor immigration violation that he's going to be put on trial for. But anyway, we continue to hope, but we continue to act. That's why you see, for instance, recently, last year we established the Union of South American Countries, UNASUR, which is kind of a European Union in Latin America, and with the establishment of the military bases in Colombia by the U.S., there was a summit of UNASUR countries, and there was a unanimous rejection of the U.S. trying to bring back the era of military bases in Latin America. And this is something that is unprecedented. I just don't, even conservative countries, express concerns at, the U.S. establishing this bases in Colombia. So, so we're not just hoping, but we're acting. And I encourage people to, and I hope the Guild can organize a new delegation to Venezuela, because once you go there, once you go to other countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, you see what's going on. And you will see that it's not just some presidents that have been elected and who are doing some nice things or crazy things, but it's just a whole people, I always tell people Venezuela is a country of 26 million people who are active, who are doing all kinds of good things that unfortunately in the US nobody knows about, because the strategy of the right wing in this country is to, when it comes to Venezuela, just to center everything on Chavez. So there's like, it's nobody else in that country but Chavez. And of course, when they show Chavez, they show him with some military gear and all that. And the same thing is happening with other countries, with Bolivia. And it's just to ignore the social movements, to ignore the grassroots, and just to concentrate on these figures, to make them into little dictators, so that it's easier to, in the future, intervene in those countries militarily. Or, you know, doesn't have to be militarily. If you look at the millions of dollars that USAID and the NED have been sending to opposition groups in these countries, that amount to intervention. And you know, it's regime change under the table, but it's still regime change. So I guess I'll stop here because I had 5 minutes, 10 minutes ago. So thank you.
Let's not forget that the Honduras coup happened right after Honduras joined Alba. Debra.
Excuse me. Yeah, it happened right after Honduras joined Alba, and that's not, you know, a coincidence. A lot of what came out after the coup was concern about Chavez taking over Honduras. If you read the press, it was the whole campaign. And that's what we see of the right-wing senators and Republicans who have been supporting Micheletti and the coup. That's their argument. But anyway, I'm going to talk about something else. Talk louder? Okay. I want to talk a bit about Cuba and managing the impact of the global economic crisis. Martin talked about the strategy of ALBA and how important that is. Integration has been in Latin America and helping countries over both in terms of developing before the impact, but certainly helping them get through this period. And it's an approach, particularly in Cuba for the last 50 years, of not looking to the private markets to solve the problems or to create a vehicle for efficient allocation of resources, but managing the impact by having central decision-making about how to allocate resources in hard times. But before I get into how Cuba has, particularly looked at it, it's moving, and throughout Latin America, as we see with ALBA, with Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, some of the other countries as well, Brazil, Argentina, Nicaragua, Salvador, other countries are moving, have rejected the last couple of decades of policy of imposition of neoliberal economics. And so whether or not they've gone as far as Bolivia or Venezuela, they're all looking for ways to get out from under the yoke of the neoliberal policies. And along with that, there's this now rejection or discussion, at least, about the free trade agreements, the CAFTAs, the NAFTAs, and the ALCAs, that have stripped societies that have signed onto them of their ability to protect the human rights of their own populations, to make decisions to protect the economic, cultural, and social rights within their own borders, because they have given up those rights to capital to make the decisions of how these societies are going to be organized and how the resources within those countries will be allocated, and most of the time they're allocated outside of the country, so they can no longer manage the impact for their populations of these kinds of economic crises. And that's why the integration policies are so important, and this new way of trade integration and the mutual assistance is so important in Latin America. And it's one of the places that has been able to, so far, get through this period better than a lot of other regions in the world. I want to talk a little bit about how Cuba has felt the impact, because Cuba has, as we know from here, has been so isolated from the United States with this embargo, bloqueo, that has tried to strangle the economy now for close to 50 years. The challenge of economic crises is not new to Cuba, of course. I mean, the imposition of the blockade in the 60s threw Cuba into turmoil, because they were doing 85% of their trade at that time with the United States and had to reorganize the entire economy differently. And then by 1990, they were doing 85% of their trade with the Eastern Socialist bloc, and that disappeared overnight and threw the economy into a free fall. And many of you are probably aware of the level of the crisis that took place in the 1990s, what the Cubans call the special period. I began the work that I'm doing right now in Cuba in 1993, and when I went there in 93, people were still struggling, but there was an element of real fear of failure, that they were either going to starve to death or they were not going to get through this. There were long blackouts in the middle of summer in Cuba. It's very hot. The factories are often ground to a halt because there was no oil, there was no spare parts. The food production went way down. Food imports shrunk. People were really worried about how they were going to feed their families. Women would get home from work at night. There'd be no light. There'd be no gas to cook with. If you have no lights, the refrigerators don't work. The food spoils. It was horrendous. And there was also a health crisis created by the shortages as well. But how does a country like Cuba get through that? It's only possible when you have political will and a strong central government, which could be a different kind of government, but it's a strong central government that views its role as making sure that everybody gets whatever they can distribute, that there's equitable distribution, work on where the investment should go to try to bring the whole society up and not allow the resources, as it would be if it were private capital, to get siphoned off to the highest bidder, and then those who aren't part of that system completely fall off the bottom. So they actually, during this time, made a lot of decisions to decentralize economic management in the domestic economy and opened up spaces for individual economic endeavors, as you may know, the polydars and so forth. Some decisions, pragmatic decisions, that did end up creating some inequalities in Cuba, but did have the advantage of bringing capital, especially the development of tourism, bringing quick capital into Cuba, and tourism acted as an engine to get the entire economy moving again. And then in 2000, and then the economy began to grow and stabilize with problems. People often say to me that, you know, and it's very popular in the press here, and Martina's talked about the distortions in our press, but so often the press will say the embargo is irrelevant, it's Cuba's problems that create this, and they just like to use the embargo as an excuse. But as someone, as a lawyer who works with the embargo regulations every day, the embargo is not only very relevant, it gets worse all the time. There's been no softening of this embargo or blockade. And in the recent years, the U.S. has also messed with Cuba's financial relations with third countries, not simply trade relations. So there's a serious problem that Cuba has now with credits and just getting normal banking relations just to be able to have trade. Then again, in 2008, Cuba was hit with 3 horrific hurricanes between Ike, Gustav, and Paloma, and whatever crazy mind could think of the name of Paloma for a devastating hurricane beyond me. But anyway, these 3 hurricanes last year caused enormous destruction in Cuba of the infrastructure. Enormous destruction in agriculture throughout the island, almost in every region. Hundreds of thousands of homes were damaged or destroyed. And at the same time, in the fall of 2008, the global economic crisis hit. And Cuba, even though it's, that's not tied to the US economy in any way, has been severely affected by the economic crisis. Why? Because the prices of raw materials around the world as production ground down plummeted. And Cuba's main hard currency export has been nickel. There are very rich nickel mines in Cuba. And as the price of nickel plummeted from a very profitable margin down to just a little bit over the cost of production, Cuba lost this important export earner. And so then the amount of money in the economy for other things also shrunk. Fortunately, tourism, oddly, stayed fairly stable in Cuba while it went way down in the rest of the region. And so although they haven't increased their earnings on tourism very much to make up for the nickel losses, at least tourism stayed fairly steady. So the situation in Cuba today remains fairly delicate, despite the assistance and the level of integration with other countries. I mean, Venezuela, of course, has been extremely helpful. The development, you talked about the refinery in Nicaragua, but there's another refinery in Cienfuegos in Cuba, which is then supplying the Caribbean with refined products. And that joint project has been extremely important economically to Cuba and to the region. But they still have a tremendous cash problem. And one of the things that was interesting hearing the speaker today at lunchtime is that Cuba also was importing about 80% of its food. And it's an agricultural country, has very rich agricultural land. And a lot of people in Cuba then began to question, what's going on? Why? Why, with all of these years of policy to become self-sufficient, have we not spent time thinking about agricultural independence and food security? One of the reasons, I think, had to do with the fact that when there did exist the socialist bloc, there was this barter arrangement of food exchange. And then the pragmatic decisions to come through the crisis were putting money into quick capital generating areas of the economy in order to get the whole economy to come up. But now the focus is on food security and growing food in the country. A lot of land has been redistributed to small farmers so that they will enter into the agricultural economy with the kind of equipment and aid that Martine talked about that is necessary when you have new people coming in to the economy and developing further the agricultural cooperatives. These things take time, but they've reclaimed land that had been laid fallow, that wasn't being used, that had been taken over by the marabou plant, which is really nasty. And so the big projects to clear land, to now develop rice production in Cuba and other kinds of agricultural production so that they are not so dependent on imports. So that's one of the major changes that have been taking place, I'd say, in the last 2 or 3 years under Raul Castro, who has been really pushing those kinds of reforms. They've also embarked on a lot of environmentally sound policies, energy-saving policies, reducing the dependence on oil, trying to look to green energy production possibilities through wind, through solar, although the initial investment in solar is very high. But also having national programs to reduce the use of energy. Distributing, saving light bulbs, these, I forget what you call them, but anyway. Yeah, so that everybody uses these in their homes. In the summertime, because of the crisis, they've made all workplaces turn air conditioners off until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And it saved a lot of electricity. Unfortunately, a lot of these workers are working in buildings that were not built in the 30s and 40s, that were built for non-air conditioned, high ceilings, big open windows. The newer buildings from the 50s on, dependent on air conditioners. It was kind of tough for some of these workers to figure out how they were going to get through those hours. But the highest sun is in the midday, and so they managed to get through that. But again, it's a collective decisions that can be made in this kind of society that cannot take place or will not take place in a country like ours, where there isn't the political will to develop the collective base for this kind of enterprise. A couple of the other strategies that I can talk to, I've talked about agriculture, tourism, is biotech. And maybe some of you know this, maybe not, but Cuba has, since the 1990s, developed a very strong biotech industry, really advanced biotechnology. So advanced, of course, that now they're, at least in 2002, they're being accused of developing a bioweapons program. The Bush administration made a big to-do about this, and it's sort of been silent about it recently. But it's very impressive, and it's another way in which they not only are earning money by selling their products abroad, but also assisting some of the other countries in the regions by supplying less expensive drugs for the other populations through their production of genetic drugs, as well as some of their more advanced discoveries and vaccines and so forth. And so it's another aspect of this integration that's important. But part of the biotech thing, and Martín mentioned the educational programs. There's this program called Yo Si Puedo that Cuba developed to expand literacy around the world. It's not only in Latin America, but they've taken the programs to countries that are not Spanish-speaking either. As one of the most important things in terms of not only democracy, of providing people the tools so they can participate in decision-making, but also as the first step so that people can become educated and get onto higher levels of education so that they can participate in the development of their own economies. Because so often that is not possible. University education is not possible for poor populations, and it's only the elite that can keep reproducing itself by having access to higher education. And so one of the things that Cuba has done in this period is not only increase the access of its own population to university level education, they've continued to expand that throughout the island so that people now have a much higher level of education in terms of technology and use of technology in Cuba. But they've opened their doors, and the medical school is famous, where they have invited medical students from poor countries, developing countries, to study medicine in Cuba and then go back and practice medicine, but also in engineering, in computer sciences, in other areas. Students from around the world and the region go to Cuba to study, but also the Cubans go and help develop these resources in other countries. And increasing the level of education, Obama's talked about it here. I mean, everyone's aware that you cannot continue. You can't really develop into the new an economy of the new century without that level of preparation. And that's been another one of its contributions, and also a way in which it has managed to help its own population through this crisis with a view, a long-term view, which is only can come from socialism, because the capitalists don't have long-term views. They only have a view as long-term as this year's dividends for the shareholders. They have a long-term view of development. When Fidel Castro made the decision, well, they say it's his decision, when the Council of State made the decision to invest in biotech, in the 1990s, in the middle of the special period economic crisis, they were highly criticized from people on the outside, particularly the United States. What are you doing spending money on biotech when people need food? But it was this long-term view of bringing the population along so that there will be sustained development, not just solving the problems today. I guess just to end, because my time is coming to an end and I'm certainly willing to take questions, is that one of the important things and lessons for the long view here as well is the importance of sustaining change through the building of a social base that's capable of real and critical participation in the process. And so there's a challenge for opening up the processes for real participation, of not succumbing to paranoia because of this big enemy to the north, and to continuing this process of growth and change and developing the population and developing the people's own ability to solve problems in the society. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that's happening in the region between Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and other countries, is building that social base, of providing the vehicles for the social base to sustain real change. Because it can happen sometimes only when you have strong leadership at the top that can make this change happen. But if you don't bring the base up, and it's a lesson for us here as well, because we've certainly been knocked over the head by not having a strong base of support for progressive change, it won't be sustained. And that's one of the most important lessons I think about getting through this crisis, by also the same time developing the cultural, educational base of the social movements.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, the problem is that before we didn't have legislation to prohibit that, because we never had that problem, or maybe we did, but we never identified it. And it is, I think, thanks to the power of the internets, that now all this information is out and it's accessible to people. And I think we just didn't envision this as a way of destabilizing the countries. And you know, the 80s was a decade of big growth, the 80s and the 90s, of NGOs in this country. So now that we have legislation, it's very hard to enforce, because we don't have very well, trained intelligence gathering service, and in other cases, a lot of the money is deposited overseas. And now when they release some of the documents, basically we learned this through declassified documents through the Freedom of Information Act. But all the names of the key people are always grayed out. So in many cases you cannot invest. You know that there's money going in, and you don't know where they deposited money. Probably it's in U.S. accounts. A lot of Venezuelans have accounts in the U.S., so it's not that difficult for them to access the funds and use them. And in other cases, a lot of the funds are used to train people here, or train people in places like Belgrade, for instance. A lot of opposition students in Venezuela were sent to Belgrade to get training to do some sort of, color revolution in Venezuela, because they had the experience there with Milosevic. So, it's very hard to trace those funds. So,
I think Bolivia, though, did or has attempted to legislate, outlaw, but again, I think you're right. I mean, how do you trace the money? How do you stop it?
And again, the countries are accused of opposing democracy because, you know, it's the national endowment for democracy. So if you're against that, then you're against democracy. So you're a dictator and you have to be overthrown.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the few measures that the Obama administration announced and actually issued the regulations not too long ago, I think in early September, to allow telecommunications companies to invest to improve telecommunications services in Cuba and a whole bunch of things. But of course, I mean, that requires the Cuban government and its telecommunications company to want to deal with the U.S. companies. So it remains to be seen. One thing that would, might come out of this is that direct telephone communication between the United States and Cuba was permitted since 1992. And then after the United States government allowed the Brothers to the Rescue guys to freeze the funds of the telephone companies, so the monies that were due to the Cuban telephone company because of this arrangement, the Cubans then said, you're going to do that, we're going to put a tax on the phone calls coming from the United States until we get paid back this money that you just took. And then the United States, well, so they wouldn't let them pay the tax. So then all phone service went through third countries. So maybe this is going to get that unstuck, so there'll be direct phone service and they'll pay the tax. I don't know. So there may be something about it. Also another aspect of it is, and this was in the news today, another joint Venezuela-Cuba project is building an underwater fiber optic cable. There's a lot of stuff in the press about Cuba doesn't allow people access to the internet. They have actually expanded access to the internet, but the problem is they don't have access to the fiber optic cable. So the bandwidth is really small. And I have
Through satellite only.
To satellite only. So I have access to the internet on a dial-up, and I know for you that's like the Stone Age. And every time I try to get on now, it's slower and slower. I put a note on one of the sign-up sheets, don't send me any document over 200K because I can't download it. And so the problem of having further access in Cuba is this problem of how many people, it's so saturated with the people who use it. So this project is to build this cable that will then help Cuba link into the fiber optic underwater cable so they'll have broadband access. The Obama administration, this brings me back to your question, has approved now authorized licenses so U.S. companies can hook Cuba up to a fiber optic cable. But of course it's got to be, whether Cuba wants to deal just with the U.S. company or prefer to keep this joint venture going where they feel a lot more secure about the communications. So those kinds of things are going on. Well, are they cooperatives? Right? Yeah. First, I think what Raul meant when he's talking about rejecting egalitarianism is that to stimulate people, it's the thing, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. And so the question is really that given the way the economy is developing, some people are making more money than others, which is not huge differentials, but some levels of difference of income. And people who work harder, who contribute more, do earn more money. And I think that's what he meant about it, that, and there's a lot of emphasis on people being more efficient, working harder, finding ways of saving resources. And so there are new salary initiatives that give bonuses when those things are met, when there's greater production, greater efficiency, and greater resource savings. And so that does create some differentials. Right? So I think that's really what he was talking about, not having big disparities in wealth as a way of resolving the problems. And certainly in agriculture, the farmers do quite well. It's, you know, and so it's another incentive because they need food production to get people to stay on the land. It's hard work. In the cooperatives, I don't know enough about the agricultural area to tell you exactly what their role is in all of this, but I know that the people who are being allocated land or being able to either rent it or obtain the land, the usufruct of land, are being encouraged to work in cooperatives for lots of reasons. One is for pooling resources for fertilizers or equipment and so forth. But I'm not an expert in agriculture, so I don't know the entire role of that particular cooperative.
Well, you had to look at what happened in 2002 during the coup d'etat to get a glimpse of what the opposition will do once they overthrow Chavez. I mean, basically, yeah, the guy who took power, you know, abolished the Supreme Court, fired all elected governors, mayors, and the Congress was also dismissed. So, and there was a big wave of repression in 2 days. You know, there's an untold number of people who were either killed or harassed, put in jail, and you know, it's just a glimpse of what's waiting. You know, people who claim who accused Chavez of being a dictator when they had the chance. Look what they did in only 2 days. Look at what they're doing, for instance, in Honduras. You know, accuse the president of concentrating power. A president who didn't control the military, didn't control the Supreme Court, didn't control the Congress, but somehow he was amassing power and he had to be overthrown. So, you know, there's been you know, other attempts. 3 years ago, there was a group of 150 to 200 paramilitaries from Colombia who were being trained outside of the capital, Caracas, and you know, they always keep, you know, finding extra constitutional ways to get rid of Chavez. Chavez's support, actually, if you count the percentages election after election, it has increased slightly. Right now, the latest polls put his approval rating in about 61%. So, you know, even higher than President Obama's, I would say. And, you know, this is after 10 years of being in office. So that's the big nightmare for the opposition there, that the majority of the population keeps supporting the president, because not only because of what has been done. Venezuela is a country with a lot of problems. We have inflation is the highest in Latin America. We have a big problem with crime. There, housing, a lot of problems. But people have seen the changes. They compare the way it used to be and, you know, the way it's now, you know, access to healthcare, access to education, to cheaper housing and things like that, cheap food. So, and of course the opposition, they lack a meaningful project, you know, when they lay down their plans, you know, sometimes secret documents, you know, which contemplate privatizing the oil industry, privatizing some things, then people say, we're not going to go back to the 80s and 90s where we tried privatizing everything and it failed. So, you know, the lack of a project and the lack of a strategy and unity among the opposition makes them, you know, but actually Chavez's, our own inefficiencies in many cases work against us. In the last elections that we had for governors and mayors, the pro-Chavez camp lost a big chunk of the electoral map, and because some mayors and governors were not efficient at doing their job, and we're living in a democracy, and, you know, people say, well, we're not going to keep it. We like Chavez, but we don't like this governor, so we'll elect another governor. So.
I just want to add one thing to what Martin was saying, and he made such a good point about use of language. And what happens is these new leaders in Latin America are called now here populists. And they're populists because the population votes for them, because poor people vote for them. So if poor people vote for you, you become a populist. And if you're a populist, then automatically you become authoritarian. And then from there, it's just a small step to dictator. So to me, a populist is somebody who's speaking to the people. You know, it doesn't mean that it's a demagogue. But language here in the press, and we need to be aware of it, changes the conversation. It makes it difficult to have an open and reasonable conversation about these issues.
Well, the bank is just getting started, and but basically their aim is at financing projects that are targeted towards getting some countries on the path to development. So there's some key sectors of industry in each country that need development. So in Venezuela, for instance, we have a big deficit of doctors. Well, we set up a Latin American School of Medicine in Caracas to train doctors not only from Venezuela but from all over Latin America. So there are some key things. For instance, maybe space technology is not a priority for us right now, but food is. So in many cases, the private banks finance projects that have the highest rate of return. In the case of the Bank of the Alba, that will not be the main driving force of, the main motivation to give out a loan, but actually a project that will really help the country and the region to develop. There's something that I totally skipped that I wanted to say in my talk, that it has to do with the meaning of this talk, and it's the fact that because of the economic policies of having a strong state in these countries, and in particular case of Venezuela, we have our international reserves are the highest they ever been right now, and this has allowed us to. Because the price of oil goes up and down, and Venezuela is heavily depending on oil exports. We've been saving money, a lot of money, since 2003 when we were able to bring the economy back from recession. And so this year and next year, in spite of the world economic crisis, we will not reduce by a single penny any of the social programs that the country has. The food subsidies, the employment programs, the microloans, nothing will be reduced. Of course, we in the government have to tighten our belts. We had this year a reduction in 7% in the budget. I wanted to do a lot of things in my office, buy new equipment, a lot, can't do it, had to postpone it. But the important things for the people, the social programs, the education, healthcare, none of that will be reduced. And that is only possible when you have the political will and you have a strong government that's able to, drive the economy and establish policies for the benefit of everybody and not for a tiny minority. So, as I always say, we don't have socialism in Venezuela. If you go there, you'll go to see a lot of malls, a lot of McDonald's and things. But we're trying to build an alternative. If we have said that by decree, now we're a socialist country, then that will go against what socialism is really about, which is the power of the majority, power for the workers, and that's what we want to build in Venezuela, in spite of the many problems that we have. But it's an imperfect thing, but we're trying to build it. Thank you
so much.